Eddie Molloy is a director in advanced organisations. His key focus is on the individual. How can the managers of the Irish subsidiary change their mindset from Boy Scout to subversives? And he's developed a very interesting study around how subsidiary multinationals break free from narrow mandates, whose future might be limited, into broader and higher value-added fields. The exact process that companies like Apple, Intel, Dell, etc. and others have engaged on. So I'd like to hand over to Eddie Molloy. Please give him a round of applause.
An extraordinary title. I don't know how that came out of the conversation we had over the phone, but there it is. So I'll get straight into it. I only have 15 minutes. This framework here is the one I use in the work I do. So currently I'm applying this framework. Just to give you the range, it would be the Irish Heart Foundation, the National Library, the PM Group, which is a big international engineering group, and others, okay? Even the Chinese New Year Festival that I'm working on the future of that. I'm not going to go into it all. I've the reference there on the bottom if you ever want to get hold of it. By far the best article I've ever read in all the literature on strategy. And for me, I make a living out of that and some other seminal articles. But what I'm doing, what isn't in the article is my mindset box. What I'm saying is that the mindset of the people in the room who are developing the strategy determines every single one of those, what comes out. And I'm going to give you just a few examples, first of all, so that you get this. And you can become more and more sophisticated in how you go about. So in the early stages of a strategy process, that what I'm going to describe this evening is put on the table. In other words, where are your heads at, those of us in this room who are developing the strategy? I was down in Cork one time in the Roche's Town Park Hotel, and as you look out, you're looking out towards the river, and there's a field between you and the river. And I was trying to get this point across about mindset. So I said, look, I said, if we sent out into the field here, I said, a farmer, an archaeologist, and a nature lover, to tell them to report back on what they saw, the farmer would come back in and say, well, what I saw was good grass there, you could put 12 cattle on that, and so on. The archaeologist would come in excited because he'd seen some contours and humps that suggested some medieval ruins underneath. And the naturalist would be jumping up and down because he'd found badger droppings or some other thing. So I was enjoying my metaphor because I felt it was working. This guy at the back says, they're all blind, boy. I said, how do you mean? Make a great 18th hole. Now, I don't play golf. I would never see an 18th hole out there. Do you follow me? So the formation of the people. Second example, working with Waterford Foods many years ago before they merged with Avonmore. And I wasn't really aware of this, and this is something that prompted me to start using this. In the middle of, somewhere in the thick of this process of developing a strategy for Waterford Foods, this guy said to me, do you know what you're dealing with here in this room? I said, what? He said, you're dealing with hardened arteries and a narrow genetic pool. So I said, what do you mean? He said, everyone in this room except the head finance guy is a graduate of the University College Cork Dairy Science Programme. So here you have a cloning, do you follow me, in the room. Now that's the issue, that the people in the room. A third example, I spent a week in a hotel with the Catholic bishops a few years ago. You can imagine what that was about. And we were trying to develop a strategy, a long-range view of the Catholic Church. And I used the word, look, you need to plan, okay, because the number of priests is going down, people are abandoning the church, you need to plan. And one of them said to me, he said, before we think of our own plans, we should be asking ourselves, what's God's plan for us? Okay, so what's in the heads of the people in the room is a constraint on what comes out. It mediates everything else. Now, to get more practical about this, here's a list of things, and I'm going to just rattle through these in the time I have available. The first one is conservative versus progressive, otherwise known as Boy Scout and subversive. I changed the language of that for a recent client because I didn't like the idea of subversive being put up with some German owners. So Boy Scout is somebody who dutifully fulfills the mandate that has been granted to him by the corporation. Okay? And this is what you got to do. I spent the afternoon in Diageo, where I've worked for many decades, 3 decades as a consultant, under huge pressure to deliver on a new project and get the cost of goods down. That's it. So you get these very strong mandates. The Boy Scout says, yes, sir, no, sir, how much higher do you want me to jump, sir? The subversive says, asks a different question. So the key to this is the question that's asked. The subversive asks, how can I deliver on my mandate as given? The subversive asks, how can I add value to the corporation? Now, once you do that, you open up all kinds of things. So Kieran Ennis is here from IBM. The story of IBM in Ireland was, and William Burgess saw a lot of this stuff earlier on, read the Blue Book. Question was, how does IBM deliver on its sales targets in Ireland and maintain the machines it was selling? Change the question to how does the group of people there assembled in IBM in Ireland add value to the corporation? And Pandora's box is opened, and there are 5,000 people, whatever it is, working on the campus. That's a crucial thing. I'll just go through one or two others to illustrate. Sorry, here. Time frame. What time frame are we looking at? A lot of corporates give a mandate to the subsidiary. It only has about a 3-year time frame. And it's not enough to prompt questioning about what's beyond that. So I work with Ericsson's and many other companies in Ireland where the 3-year time frame is far too narrow to conceive of getting out of the business they were in and getting into something of higher added value, as happened in Ericsson, for example. Organizational boxes. Developing strategy with Guinness, as it was a number of years ago. The people in the room were the head of the brand managers, highly paid people, brand for Guinness, brand manager for Hart, brand manager for Smithwick's, Budweiser, and so on and so forth. The brand managers in the room, that's who was there in a hotel. Nothing came out of those deliberations to do with what's called moderation drinking. Non-alcohol beers, water. People don't have 2 pints at lunch now. And the reason was the structure is determining the strategy. That's very important. So you have to have a series of antidotes to that, such as I have up here. So parallel teams, diagonal slices, and so on. Something I might come to later on. For example, developing the strategy for the IDA. I lose track of time, it's probably about 7 years ago. I worked with Sean Dorgan and his team for 6 months. But what we did was we had a parallel team of people who had been no longer than 2 years in the IDA. We got more out of that team than we did out of the senior team. Okay? So there's another way to open up the mindset. The business model, my mate Ian Cairns is finishing a PhD in this in California at the moment. It's challenging every single element of the business, every element. The technology you're using, the people you have, the country, every single element. And I can't, obviously, in the time available here, drill down too much into that. Taboos. What are the taboos, the undiscussables? Now, by definition, they're undiscussable and they're not discussed. So you have to at least say to people, you know, what is not being discussed here? And that's about challenging icons, challenging the pint. Yeah, how long will that last? IBM challenging their PCs, challenging your own crown jewels and not taking for granted that it will endure forever. I'll try to think of other examples of that in a minute. The mission. Mission tends to be very stable, but in periods of major change, you need to have a look at it. So working with the Controller and Auditor General, the mission of the Controller and Auditor General is to report on the integrity, propriety and regularity in the use of public money. Report on after the event. I suggested that their mission should be to progressively advance and improve the quality of corporate governance in relation, in which case reporting is only one strategy. I'll tell you a story working with the Coombe Hospital on the mission statement. And the Coombe Hospitals used to be called the Coombe Maternity Hospital. It used to be called the Coombe Lying In Hospital. Women went there for 3 weeks for a holiday. It was then called the Coombe Maternity Hospital, and when I was working with them, it began to be called the Coombe Women's Hospital. So what was the mission? What's the difference? If you're just a maternity hospital, what's your mission? It's to deliver babies and pre- and postnatal care. If you're a women's hospital, it means being specialist with women's health from cradle to grave. So I began working with people in the Coombe about this thing of cradle to grave. And somebody said, it's not just cradle to grave in here, it's womb to tomb. And then somebody remembered the story of Brendan Behan was in the Labour Party back in the 50s, and they were in a smoke-filled room somewhere up in Parnell Square, and they were working on a slogan for the election for Labour. And somebody came up with, vote Labour, they care for you from cradle to grave. Somebody else bettered it and said, no, vote Labour, they care for you from womb to tomb. And Brendan Bean says, you're all wrong. He said, vote Labour, they care for you from erection to resurrection. So, next one is language. Words that have become well used in the business. It's hard to think of examples until you're in the middle of it, okay? So in the National Library, who are the readers? They're largely research people and so on, when it really should be, what's in the National Library should be available universally, literally throughout the world. Patients in the healthcare system. The public interest, I hear it when I'm working inside the civil service. Our job is to protect the public interest. But actually, if you drill down into that, and I've done it, I've confronted it, it often is to protect the minister. So they equate protecting the minister with the public interest, which isn't the same thing, and so on. So it's having an eye for, and as often an external person will see this. Measurement. Apple Cork compared to Apple Singapore. Apple Singapore's cost per whatever the hell they were making at the time, transistors I think, is cheaper than Cork. So what should the company do? Close down Cork, put the production into Singapore, based on that metric. But landed cost in Europe was cheaper from Cork. Now I could give you a half dozen examples where the measurement architecture that's being used by the corporate headquarters has to be interrogated in order to see how we're really doing. Pepsi's another example, and so on. The hardened arteries and neurogenetic mold. Success. Success can short-circuit further success. And if you've read the Blue Book, you'll see that in there. And I have a few others, but basically that's the toolkit that you can spend the morning on is often enough. Once you flag these things, they're no longer dysfunctional, because people will remember them and say, listen, I think we're doing a bit of the Boy Scout here. Why don't we think more subversively? Now, I'm not going to be able to go into any detail on, if you like, this will sound very precious, the intellectual background to the Boy Scout subversive stuff. And it is that this is a summary. You get copies of this, so you'll be able to read, but I'm going to give you the gist of it. I spent the best part of 6 years working on a PhD on stages of adult development. So if you think most developmental psychology looks at infancy, children, adolescent, teenage, and so on into adulthood. But some adults are more mature than others, and you can clinically assess that. Now, roughly speaking, there are people who are grown up who are at what's called the pre-conformist stage. They're just cute whores, to give you a shorthand. Opportunist, no kind of moral compass, short-term perspective, always looking for advantage, and so on and so forth. Then you have where many people settle, and it is conformist. So they're dutiful, they accept conventional roles, and they do what's done. They follow the crowd in many ways. Their preoccupations are kind of immediate, short, and so on. So I have this profile. I just possibly can't drill down to it. They speak in terms of superlatives. My mother was a saint. Nobody's mother was a saint. Okay, so the undifferentiated kinds of things. A lot of cliche involved in terms of emotion. Now, what I was observing was that the teams at the time, the very first one was with Index Software in Galway. What I was dealing with were good people, but they had been kind of forced into a straitjacket of thinking in conformist terms. Okay, I noticed that. And I remember saying, you need to be more subversive. And that's being more self-directed, more autonomous, moving up to higher levels of maturity. And often it's latent there, it's there, but the organization can squeeze it back. It creates what's called regression back to an earlier stage. So people who have the capacity and have already reached a certain stage of development find themselves functioning in a very conformist mode, and it gets rewarded. The person gets their bonus and their brownie points and their end of year good appraisal because they delivered on the numbers. So that is the background. And if you have a look at it, you'll be able to make sense of it just in there. The way it's assessed, if you're interested in it, psychological tests, it uses what's called a projective method. So it gives very little information to the person. It says project yourself onto this. And the projective method uses is incomplete sentences, which I have here. And I'll just give you one or two examples. So I would have used these. Finish the sentence. A good boss. At a very low level, You get very impulsive reactions. Good boss, no such thing. Conformist level, a good boss looks after you. More developed level, a good boss will challenge you. Even higher levels, a good boss is probably a good father. It's less egocentric, for example, the reference point, and so on. And what I can do is, there's 36 of these. Haven't done it for years, by the way. But one I remember some of these. At work, I like to know. This is about what's in people's heads about communication and what they want to know. And I finish on this. Remember, one of the completions I got was, at work, I like to know the girls. Thanks very much. That's all I have to say.